"Can you be my daddy for one night?" The lonely CEO millionaire froze when he saw her face. "Will you be my daddy for one night?" Thomas Blake looked up, startled. The voice came from a little girl standing just a few feet in front of him, small and shivering in the cold. She wore a red woolen sweater that was clearly second-hand, sleeves rolled up to her wrists. Her blonde curls peeked out from under a knitted hat, and her cheeks were pink from the biting wind. It was Christmas Eve in New York. The city buzzed with festivity, couples holding hands, families spilling out of restaurants, laughter floating from apartment windows above. Central Park was lit up with golden lights wound around iron lampposts, reflecting on patches of snow that had not yet turned to slush. But here on a quiet bench near the edge of the park, the world felt still. Thomas sat in solitude, dressed in an immaculate dark wool coat over a navy suit, leather gloves on one hand, the other resting on a small wrapped gift box with no name tag. The kind of box that suggested meaning, the kind of box no one had claimed. He had come here without knowing why. Maybe to escape the cocktail parties he was expected to attend, maybe to remember that somewhere, once, he had cared about Christmas. He hadn't expected company. The girl stared at him with wide, solemn eyes. "You don't have to read a story if you don't want to, but it's just one night." Thomas blinked, his brain catching up with the words. "You want me to be your father?" "Only tonight," she nodded seriously. "Just until bedtime." He glanced around, expecting to see a parent chasing after her. No one, just snow drifting through the air and the sound of a distant saxophone playing Silent Night. "I am not really the kind of man who—" "You looked lonely," she interrupted, "like me." Her honesty pierced something sharp and buried. Thomas had built empires from silence. At 35, he had everything: the penthouse, the power, the name, but not the warmth. His phone buzzed with board meetings and buyouts, not calls from family. He had not heard someone say "Merry Christmas" without expectation in years. Yet this child, this little stranger in tattered boots, offered him something no one else had: a reason to stay. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Sophie," she beamed. "My mummy says I'm brave, and sometimes I make very good decisions." He held out her small mittened hand. Thomas stared at it. It was reckless. It was absurd. It was the first time in years he felt anything. He took her hand. Sophie's grin widened as she pulled him off the bench and led him toward the sidewalk. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask if he was sure, just walked confidently, like this was the most natural thing in the world, like she had done it before. "Where are we going?" he asked. "To my house. We have dinner. Well, a small one. Mommy made chicken stew." Thomas hesitated at the street corner. "Does your mom know you're inviting strangers to dinner?" "She'll be okay once she sees you. She trusts me." "That seems unlikely." Sophie just giggled and pulled him down a narrow side street, then into a smaller alley where the buildings grew older, paint chipped and windows fogged. String lights blinked unevenly on one second-floor balcony. Thomas barely had time to register the outside of the tiny house before Sophie yanked open the door and ran in. A gust of warm air, scented with rosemary and something slightly sweet, brushed his face. The sound of sizzling from the kitchen filled the air. Then, silence. She turned. Thomas stopped cold in the doorway. Hannah, blonde hair pulled into a tired braid, sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her cheek. Her eyes, still that stormy blue gog, widened as they landed on him. A plate slipped from her hand and clattered into the sink. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind outside howled like it knew what this moment was. Thomas found his voice first. "Hannah?" Her lips parted, but no sound came out. 1,000 emotions flickered across her face. Shock, disbelief, something dangerously close to panic. She finally whispered, "What are you doing here?" He looked down at Sophie, who was already kicking off her shoes. "She asked me to come. I didn't know." Hannah stepped forward, blocking the doorway with her body. "She's 3. She says things. You shouldn't have listened." Her voice had an edge now, sharper, colder, but underneath Thomas heard something else. Fear. Sophie tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, he's my Christmas daddy, just for tonight, remember? You said we should be kind to lonely people." Hannah's breath caught. Her eyes flicked between her daughter and the man who had once meant everything to her. Thomas took a step back. "If it's too much, I'll go." "Yes," Hannah said immediately, almost too quickly. "I think that would be best." But Sophie threw her arms around his leg. "No," she cried, her voice trembling. "Please don't go. He said he'd stay for dinner." "You said we should share, Mommy." Hannah crouched down, trying to gently untangle Sophie's arms. "Sweetheart, sometimes adults—" "I like him," Sophie insisted, looking up at Thomas with pleading eyes. "He didn't laugh when I said I wanted a dad." Thomas's heart twisted. He looked at Hannah. She was frozen, torn between instincts. Her eyes were glassy now. After a long beat, she stood and backed away, arms crossed tightly across her chest. "Dinner's getting cold, Heathers," she muttered. "Stay if you must, just don't get comfortable." Thomas stepped inside quietly, closing the door behind him. He didn't speak as he took off his coat. The house was humble, small, with peeling wallpaper in the corners and scuffed wooden floors, but it was warm, lived in. A faded drawing hung crookedly on the fridge. Sophie bounced into a chair and began humming a Christmas tune, entirely unaware of the storm lingering in the room. Hannah moved around the kitchen with practiced precision, her back to Thomas. He sat beside Sophie, silently taking it all in. Dinner was served: roast chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a small bowl of cranberry sauce. Simple, homey, made with effort. The silence was suffocating. Thomas tried to focus on Sophie, who babbled about reindeer and the glittery snow globe she saw at the library. He smiled faintly, but his eyes kept drifting to Hannah, whose face remained carefully blank. Then came the moment. Sophie picked up her fork, examined her plate, and promptly scooted all the green beans to the far corner. She separated her potatoes from the chicken and chewed everything on the left side of her mouth. Thomas froze. He looked down at his own untouched green beans, his own perfectly sectioned plate, the same chewing habit right down to the side of the jaw. Something inside him shifted. He stared at Sophie for a beat too long. "She doesn't like green beans?" he asked too casually. Hannah didn't turn. "Kids are picky. She separates her food. She has her habits. Like me," he murmured under his breath, almost to himself. Then, louder, "Who's her father?" Hannah turned sharply, eyes flashing. "That is not your business." Sophie paused mid-bite, watching them both. Thomas sat back, stunned by the heat in Hannah's voice. He started, but she cut him off. "She's mine. That's all you need to know." She turned her back again, but this time her shoulders shook, and when she thought no one was looking, she wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. Thomas saw, and suddenly the warmth in the room felt colder than the winter outside. Something was wrong. He looked down at the little girl beside him, laughing softly at her own mashed potato mustache. Something was very, very wrong, and he could feel it in his bones. After the awkward dinner, Thomas and Hannah sat side by side on the little sofa in the dim living room. Sophie, sprawled across his lap, slept deeply, her breathing soft against the hum of the Christmas lights outside. Thomas gently shifted, careful not to wake her, feeling the steady rise and fall of her tiny chest. In the quiet glow of a single lamp, Thomas turned to Hannah. "Why did you leave without saying anything?" he asked, voice rough with emotion. 4 years. How did you live through them?" Hannah's eyes flickered, an ocean of pain contained there. She stared at the floor, tracing the floral pattern in the rug, her voice barely a whisper. "That's all in the past. Don't talk about it. There are things you could never understand." Thomas looked at her, his heart torn. He tried to picture those silent years, her life hidden somewhere far from his penthouse, unknown, vulnerable. Slick memories of their laughter came flooding back, shared coffee in winter, soft autumn meets, a promise in a back room of the company break area. And then the memory broke. 4 years before, they were inseparable. She was the security guard's daughter, full of light and tenderness. She tutored him when he struggled with algebra in college evenings. Slowly, their friendship turned into something deeper, a late-night world lit by street lamps and whispered dreams. When they started dating, she was careful to keep it secret. She knew what would happen when her father's face appeared on his car window, and she was right. One day, her father suffered a breakdown at work. He was fired for insubordination that never really happened. Behind the scenes, the rumors had begun. His family's influence, his mother's disapproval. Thomas's mother had pulled strings to make the dismissal permanent. Her father's once sturdy pride wilted overnight. At home, Sophie's grandmother was ill, and her younger brother needed medicine. They sold the house. They moved into a cramped apartment in a distant neighborhood where no one knew Hannah's face or her story. Late one night, in a sparsely furnished room, she woke with shock, pregnant. She didn't call Thomas. How could she? He was meant for better things. She would have crushed his life. So she didn't call. She pretended she was someone else, somewhere else. She waited. She kept silent. All that emotion, yearning, heartbreak, pride flooded back. Her tears threatened again. Thomas watched silently, knowing he had once let her disappear, believing she'd chosen another life. And now she was sitting beside him, the ghost of that life tucked against his chest. The room grew heavy with unspoken words. Hannah snuggled against the couch arm as Sophie shifted, patting her with sleepy fingers. He knelt and gently stroked Sophie's hair. "Hannah," he began softly, "I waited for you. I stayed at our bench in the park. I came back here, week after week, hoping to find you." Hannah's head lifted, her expression fraught with disbelief. Thomas pressed on. "I'd whisper your name into the night, thinking if you heard me, you'd return." She looked into his eyes, raw and vulnerable, and the dam broke. She covered her face, letting tears fall. "Yes," she whispered. "I hated that you weren't there when I needed you. I hated that you weren't protecting me. Sometimes. I still do." Thomas reached out and held her hand. She didn't pull away. Sophie slept on, breathing quietly. "They use me to control you," Hannah continued between tears. "Your family, my father, loss. I had to protect her, protect myself. I thought, by stepping away quietly, I was giving you both freedom." Thomas closed his eyes, letting her words settle into the quiet. He leaned in and kissed her hand. He turned his eyes to the sleeping child. "Whatever you needed," he whispered. "I should have known, and I'm sorry." Hannah nodded, trembling. Sophie stirred slightly, murmured in her sleep, and hugged closer. They sat in silence, 3 shadows against the lamp's glow, holding onto each other like a fragile lifeline. In that moment, the storm outside, the judgment, the heartbreak, the years of absence felt distant. Here, in the stillness, love had found a way back. The next morning, snow still dusted the streets like powdered sugar. The city, quieter in the early hours, seemed to breathe slower. Thomas stood by the front steps of the small house, glancing at his watch. The door creaked open. Sophie beamed up at him, wrapped in a too large coat and a wool hat that sagged slightly to one side. "You came," she chirped, clutching a small backpack. "You asked me to be your daddy for a day," Thomas said, offering his hand. "I keep my promises." They walked hand in hand to the nearby park, Sophie chattering non-stop about ducks and dinosaurs and what colors snowflakes really are. Thomas listened, really listened for the first time in years. Her voice, bright and unfiltered, chipped away at something old inside him. He pushed her gently on the swing, catching her every time she leaned back too far. They built a tiny snowman with a crooked smile, and she insisted on naming it Miss CEO. At the library, she curled up beside him on a beanbag. Thomas read picture books in voices he didn't know he had. Sophie giggled, her head resting against his shoulder. Later they shared donuts on a bench by the corner cafe. Frost rimmed the window behind them, and Sophie's lips were powdered with sugar. Thomas brushed it away gently with his thumb. People passed by and smiled. Some even stopped to admire them. A few nodded knowingly, assuming they were father and daughter. Thomas didn't correct them. He didn't want to. From across the street, Hannah stood near the pharmacy, watching through the fogged window, her arms folded tight across her chest, but her expression was soft. There was something haunting in her gaze. She wasn't just watching, she was remembering. That night, Thomas walked Sophie back to the doorstep. She was sleepy but glowing. "Best day ever," she murmured as he knelt to zip up her coat. He smiled, then leaned in and hugged her gently. She clung to him, her small arms around his neck. "Do daddies always smell like this?" she asked sleepily. He laughed, quiet and surprised. "I hope it's a good smell." "The best," she whispered. Thomas stood and turned to Hannah, who had just opened the door. She looked tired, guarded again. The soft smile she'd worn from afar was gone. "She's asleep already." "Smart," she said quickly. "Thank you for today." He nodded, but didn't move to leave. "She's mine, isn't she?" he asked quietly, eyes fixed on hers. The question sliced through the winter air. Hannah froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. Her eyes glistened. "I see it," he continued, voice shaking. "In the way she chews her food, the way she tilts her head when she listens, even the way she holds a crayon. It's me. She's me." Hannah's fingers tightened on the doorknob. Her throat moved, trying to swallow the ache that had lodged there all day. "I don't want anything from you," she said, barely above a whisper. "I don't want your money. I don't want your pity, and I definitely don't want your world." Thomas stared at her, the pain unmistakable. "You think I wouldn't have wanted her? That I wouldn't have wanted you? You weren't there," she snapped, then caught herself, voice breaking. "And I couldn't let your family ruin us again." A long silence. Sophie stirred slightly in her sleep, her head resting against the doorway. Thomas stepped back slowly. "I'll go," he said. He hesitated for one last second, then turned and walked down the steps into the snow-covered street. Inside, Hannah closed the door and leaned against it. She pressed a hand to her chest, where her heart had begun to ache again. She had done what she needed to do, but why did it feel like it was breaking her all over again? It started with a cough, then came the fever. By the time Hannah pressed the back of her hand to Sophie's burning forehead, panic was already surging through her chest. Within the hour, Sophie's small body began to tremble, first lightly, then violently. Her eyes rolled back. Her lips turned pale. "No, no, no, no," Hannah whispered, scooping her daughter into her arms. She raced through the snow-covered streets, feet slipping, lungs burning. The hospital was only 4 blocks away, but it felt like a mile of fear. The ER lights were too bright, the nurses moved too fast, the doctors asked questions she could barely answer. "Has she had seizures before?" "No, never." "How long has the fever been this high?" "I don't know, please, just help her." An hour later, Hannah sat in the pediatric ICU waiting room, trembling. The doctor approached, holding a clipboard, his expression grim. "We've stabilized her for now, but her white blood cell count is dangerously low. We're running full panels to confirm, but we suspect a bone marrow disorder, possibly aplastic anemia." Hannah's heart dropped. "We'll need a bone marrow transplant," the doctor continued. "To move forward, we need to test immediate family, parents, siblings, for a donor match." Hannah blinked, the world spinning. "Sophie, she doesn't have any siblings," she murmured. Her voice cracked. "And her father—" She trailed off, the weight of those words landing like a punch. The doctor placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "We don't have much time. If there's a chance he's available, we need to test him immediately." Hannah stared ahead. Her mind screamed. She hadn't wanted this. Not like this. Not a hospital room. Not IVs and beeping machines. Not with her daughter caught in the middle of a truth she had buried for 4 years. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands. Thomas answered on the first ring. "She's sick," Hannah said through sobs. "She needs a transplant, and they need her father." Thomas was already grabbing his coat. "Where are you?" "In the hospital." Thomas stood still while the nurse drew blood from his arm. His jaw was tight. He did not speak. Hannah sat across the room, eyes swollen, hands clenched around a paper cup of cold coffee. The silence between them was full of everything they could not say. 2 hours later, the doctor returned. "The results are back," he said. "It's a perfect match." Thomas barely breathed. The doctor nodded, expression softening. "You're her biological father." The room went still. Hannah let out a sound between a sob and a gasp. Her hands flew to her mouth as tears burst forward. "I didn't want it to be like this," she cried. "I didn't want you to find out this way." Thomas stepped forward slowly, his voice low, raw. "Why didn't you tell me?" Hannah looked up, eyes blazing with grief. "Because your mother looked me in the eyes and told me I would never be good enough," she choked out. "Because after she humiliated me, my father lost his job. We couldn't afford my brother's medicine. We had to move in the middle of the night, Thomas. I had nothing left but her." She pointed toward the ICU doors. "She was all I had, and I swore I would never let her be crushed by that world, the world that crushed me." Thomas was silent, his fists curled at his sides. "I was waiting for you," he said hoarsely. "You vanished. I didn't have a choice." The words echoed between them. Outside the glass walls, snow fell in silent flakes. Inside, the air was too heavy to breathe. Hannah's voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't want her to be a secret. I just wanted her to be safe." Thomas turned his gaze toward the hallway where Sophie lay, small and fragile and hooked to machines. "She will be," he said quietly. "I swear it." Then he sat down beside Hannah, their shoulders inches apart but lifetimes away. Thomas had never prayed before, not really. But that night, as he sat outside the operating room, his elbows on his knees, hands clenched together, he whispered 1,000 silent pleas into the sterile air. "Let her make it. Let her be okay. Let me be enough for once." When the door finally opened and the doctor gave him a small nod, "She's stable?" The transplant was successful. Thomas felt his breath leave his body in a rush, like he had been holding it for years. He did not go home. He refused the private room they offered. He stayed beside Sophie. She looked impossibly small under the hospital sheets, a bandage on her arm, cheeks pale but peaceful. Thomas sat in the chair beside her bed and began to read. At first, his voice was stiff, corporate. Then he softened. He read stories about dragons and little girls with capes. He changed voices, made sound effects. When Sophie stirred, barely awake, he told her gently, "I'm here. Daddy's here." And when she fell asleep again, he stayed. He did not move. Morning light spilled through the window, soft and golden. Hannah stood outside the door, watching him. Her hand was pressed against the glass, heart aching with something she had fought so long to silence. Inside, Thomas tucked the blanket higher under Sophie's chin, then leaned back in his chair, exhausted but still awake. He had not left her side, not once. Hannah wiped her eyes before stepping inside. Her footsteps were soft. Thomas looked up. She stared at him, eyes full, voice a whisper. "You could be the father she needs," she said. He opened his mouth, but she continued, her voice trembling. "But can you be the man I trust again?" Thomas stood, unsure how to respond. "I loved you," she said. "So much it hurt. And when I needed you most, I was alone. I know it was not all your fault, but you did not come for me." "I did not know," he said, voice hoarse. "Your mother said you left, that you moved on, and yours said I was nothing." The air grew thick. Thomas walked toward her. "Then let me prove them both wrong." Hannah looked at him, really looked, not the CEO, not the boy she once loved, just the man standing in front of her. Eyes red, heart open, full of fear and love. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she whispered. "I'm not asking you to." he said. "I'm asking you to let me try." Outside, the snow began to fall again. Not a storm, just a quiet blanket of white, softening the world. Inside, beside the hospital bed of the little girl who had brought them back together, something in Hannah began just slightly to melt. Thomas did not return with grand declarations. He returned with silence and action. While Sophie recovered, Thomas moved quietly through the world that had once revolved only around stock prices and quarterly gains. Now he walked through it with a different purpose. First he found the old house, the small one with peeling paint and a leaning porch, the one Hannah had grown up in, the one they lost after her father was fired. He bought it, not as a gift, but as a return. He restored the roof, fixed the windows, repainted the door the pale yellow Hannah used to love. Then he tracked down the file of her father, John Evans, a man wrongfully let go under quiet pressure, his record tarnished simply for being the father of a girl who had fallen in love with the wrong boy. Thomas used his name, his influence, and most importantly, the truth. The letter he submitted to the Board of Trustees was simple and unsparing. "My family made a mistake," he wrote, "one that cost a good man his dignity and livelihood. It is time we set it right." 2 weeks later, John's record was cleared, officially. And then came the hardest part: his mother. They met in her apartment, a place filled with crystal chandeliers and cold silence. Thomas stood across from her, no longer the boy who had bowed to her approval, but a man who had watched his daughter sleep in a hospital bed and decided he would never be silent again. "You destroyed a family," he said plainly. He said plainly, "You looked at a girl who had nothing, and you took even that from her." His mother's face tightened. "You do not understand what was at stake." "I do now," he interrupted, his voice firm, "and I am done letting you decide who deserves love and who does not." She stared at him, shocked. "For the first time in my life, I am ashamed to carry your name," he added. "Unless you're willing to admit what you did and speak to her yourself, we're done." That night, Thomas knocked on Hannah's door. She opened it slowly, unsure what to expect. He did not speak immediately. He reached into his coat and handed her a folder. Inside, the deed to her old home. Her breath caught. He handed her another, copies of the letters that had cleared her father's name. Her hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. And finally he stepped back and bowed his head, not slightly, fully. "I lost you once," he said, "and it was my fault. I let fear win. I let silence win. I do not deserve forgiveness, but I want to be the kind of man who earns the right to raise our daughter." Hannah stood frozen. For a moment she did not speak. She looked at the man in front of her, his expensive coat, his tired eyes, his quiet surrender. And then Sophie appeared at the door behind her, rubbing her sleepy eyes. "Daddy?" Thomas looked up, his voice cracked. "Hi, little one." Sophie grinned and reached out her arms. Thomas stepped forward and lifted her gently, cradling her like she was made of light. Behind them, Hannah stood in silence, her heart torn and healing all at once. She did not speak. But she did not close the door. Not this time. 1 year later. The snow outside danced like feathers from heaven, falling softly over the rooftops of the small house nestled at the edge of town. The windows glowed with warm golden light. Inside, the scent of cinnamon and pine filled the air. A tree stood in the corner of the living room, tall, imperfect, beautiful. Covered in mismatched ornaments, some store-bought, some made from glitter and popsicle sticks. Sophie's latest creation, a lopsided paper angel, perched proudly at the top. "More tinsel!" Sophie cried, running across the room with sparkles flying behind her. Her golden curls bounced as she laughed. Thomas bent down to catch her mid-run, scooping her up in his arms and spinning her once before setting her on his shoulders. "You're the boss of this tree, huh?" "I'm the designer," she declared with great seriousness. "Mommy said so." From across the room, Hannah chuckled as she untangled a string of lights. Her blonde hair was loose around her shoulders, cheeks flushed from laughter and warmth. There was a softness in her now, a lightness that had taken root slowly over the past months, a quiet healing. When the tree was finished, overflowing with lights, ornaments, and crooked garlands, Sophie clapped her hands. "It's perfect." Then, as the clock neared bedtime, she tugged on Thomas's sweater. "Daddy, story?" Thomas nodded, his voice already gentle. "Of course." He sat on the sofa, arms open, and Sophie climbed into his lap without hesitation, snuggling under his chin. Hannah joined them, curling beside Thomas and resting her head lightly on his shoulder. He opened a worn picture book, one they had read many times before, and began, "Once upon a time, in a land not too far away." His voice was steady, soothing. A tone he once reserved for boardrooms and negotiations now filled a small living room with comfort and magic. As he read, Sophie's eyelids began to flutter. Her little fingers clutched the corner of the page, and her breathing slowed. Halfway through the story, Thomas paused. He looked down at the child in his arms, then at the woman beside him, and for a moment, time stood still. "I used to think silence protected people," he said quietly, "that if I stayed quiet, if I stayed distant, I could keep myself from breaking." Hannah looked up at him. "I lost everything once, because I did not fight, because I did not speak, but I will never make that mistake again." He turned to face her more fully, his eyes filled with something deep and unwavering. "I love you, Hannah. I love her, and I will say it every single day for the rest of my life." Not in grand speeches, just Vilate showing up and staying. Hannah blinked, her throat tightening. Sophie stirred slightly in his arms, murmuring in her sleep, "Daddy." Thomas smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "I'm right here." Outside, snow continued to fall. The world was quiet, peaceful. Inside, 3 hearts beat as one. There were no fireworks, no dramatic declarations, just presence, just warmth. Just a man who had once believed love was too fragile to hold, now holding it tightly against his chest. And a woman who had once feared hope, now allowing herself to rest in it. And a little girl who had once asked for a father, now asleep in the arms of the one who never stopped showing up. They did not need a perfect Christmas. They had each other. And in the soft glow of twinkling lights, wrapped in a single embrace, they had everything. And that is the story of a single question whispered on a snowy Christmas Eve, a question that melted years of silence, mended 2 broken hearts, and created a home from nothing but love. Sometimes the most extraordinary families are not born from perfect circumstances, but from imperfect people choosing each other, day by day. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the quiet power of showing up, of second chances, of how even the smallest voice can lead someone home, please like, share, and subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories.